Um, we looked at the beginning of our discussion at the biblical and rabbinic period where there didn't seem to be any explicit dogma recorded in the Torah, no systemization of dogma in the Talmud. And that got us to asking the initial questions that we started with. Are we obligated exclusively in our actions, or are there obligatory beliefs as well? And if there are beliefs, what are they, and are they universally accepted? We saw at the very beginning of our discussion, Bachi ibn Pekude, talking about how all of the focus in his day was on the chavot evarim, the limbs, the duties of the limbs, meaning halacha, and there wasn't enough concentration on what one needed to be thinking about, feeling with regard to one's inner thoughts and one's inner intellectual convictions. And so he therefore wrote chavot levavot in the beginning of the medieval period, and that got the medieval Jewish philosophers into thinking based on what was going on in their historical context, the persecution that they were experiencing, the delineation of dogma in Islam and in Christianity motivated them to delineate a systematic dogma, not necessarily innovating anything new, but rather just systematizing that which had been taken for granted or perhaps experienced more palpably during the biblical and the rabbinic period. And therefore, Rambam, the first to really formally delineate the Yud Gimel Karim in his Pirush Mishnayot for access to all of the masses, systematized 13 essential principles and laid it out to the extent that if one denies any of them, one loses their chilek and Olam Haba, is deprived of immortality. And we see that he takes this stance, and we see that that caused some debate amongst his those Jewish philosophers that followed him and were influenced by him or deviated from such influence. And so we saw in the last several weeks, after going through what Rambam really did consider to be the essential principles of faith, essential ikarim that one must believe in order to be defined as a Jew, in order to be included in Klal Yisrael, we saw after that a lot of different Jewish philosophers, starting with Shimon ben Samach Duran. We saw Chasdai Kreskas, we saw Yosef Albo, and last week we saw Abram Babago and Yitzchak Abravanel, and we saw how they either followed Rambam's influence or deviated from that influence in significant ways. All of them did believe there was some sense of obligatory beliefs, but they differed from Rambam on a number of levels. Number one, the number of beliefs. Number two, the obligatory status of such beliefs. And number three, the significance of intentions with regard to accidental heresy. And so the two final questions we asked at the very beginning of our learning together was, if one denies any of these obligatory beliefs, is one punishable? And what happens if you deny them accidentally, if you're well-intended and come to violate one of or deny one of the ikarim? And so we saw in the later medieval Jewish philosophers a number of differences with regard to these questions. Some would argue that, yeah, there are obligatory beliefs, but there is room for shkaga, just as there is room in halacha for doing something accidentally. So too, there's room in theology for denying. If you take the Torah literally and thereby believe in anthropomorphisms and God's corporeality, one does not lose their chiluk and Olam Haba. And so we saw those who agreed with Rambam on this stance. Specifically, we saw Bavanel and Babago following Rambam's stance last week. And they said, just like if you accidentally drank something thinking it was healthy, but rather it was poisonous, it would still have that same corruptive consequence on your body, even if you drank it thinking it was going to be healthy for your body. And similarly, Abravanel would argue that just as if you believe, even erroneously, even accidentally, in something that was heretical, it will still have that spiritually corruptive force upon you, consequence upon you, even if you believe that with good intentions. And so we see that others like Duran and Kreskas and Albo take a different approach and are much more lenient with regard to this. Yes, you believed in something erroneously, you need to do tshuva, you need to repair your ways, but if you would have known that you were doing it wrong, you would have changed your ways because it wasn't a deliberate violation of an ikar. And so we saw along those lines, and we also mentioned when we were looking at the history of the delineation of dogma that there were lulls in Jewish history when the discussion of, or the debate of Jewish dogma wasn't necessarily on the forefront of anyone's mind. And therefore, it erupted based on the historical context. And so we saw in Rambam's time, Rambam felt the need in order to allow his co-religionists to defend themselves. And we saw we're kind of a 200-year lull, and then it came up once again. It came up once again 200 years later with the persecution in Spain, starting in 1391, and then going through the Inquisition and the expulsion. And we see after Ravenel, again, there's more of a lull. And so I ended our session last week before kind of transitioning into the modern era now. I ended the session last week by asking you 3 questions to think about. Number one, why do you think the topic of dogma virtually is no longer discussed? Meaning, why the lull? Why is it no longer on the forefront of one's mind when one thinks about our Jewish observance, especially with regard to halakha? How come theology, how come beliefs is not necessarily a prominent topic of discussion? And I also asked, what do you think is the modern conception of dogma? And how do you suppose it has changed since this medieval conception? When we think about the medieval era, and we think about how Rambam and Yosef Albo and the others concretized dogma, do you have that same conception of dogma in modern times? So the 3 questions that I just wanted you to think about, or what I want you to start with before we look at Kellner's kind of contemporary stance, is why do you think the topic of dogma isn't really on the forefront of our mind anymore? It hasn't necessarily fostered tremendous discussion within the Jewish community or within the modern Orthodox community. And I don't mean modern Orthodox, I just mean like contemporary Orthodox community. And what is the modern conception of dogma? Do we still, Vivian said at the very beginning of our studying together, she still conceptualizes dogma with, or what comes to mind when we ask about dogma is Rambam's Yikim Karim. Is that the modern conception, do you think, of dogma, either within the Orthodox community or the broader Jewish community? And if that's not, how has it changed? How has the modern conception of dogma changed since the medieval systemization of dogma? Any thoughts on any of those 3 questions?
Can I ask you a question first? Why do we have Yigdal in the liturgy?
Why do we have Yigdal?
Mm-hmm.
I think to remind us in a very, well, number one, poetic, but if these are kind of essential components of faith, and meaning you could say the same thing, why do we have these affirmations after davening and shacharit of the ani ma'amin? If these were considered, at least in medieval times, to be not necessarily you lose your chelek in Allah, but certainly significant in one's Jewish conception of theology, and many of them one could say are derived directly from the Torah, whether it's Shema Yisrael or from a couple of the Aseret HaDibrot. It's number one, something that's kind of repeated on a daily basis in liturgy, reminds us of the Zikarim, perhaps to kind of contribute to the uniformity or the universal acceptance in a way that just studying, having something in Torah Sheba'al Peh or having something in like a classical, even medieval sefer wouldn't necessarily have that same uniform acceptance as if it's affirmed daily in liturgy.
Can I answer the
Please.
question?
Please.
I'll posit an answer. I'm not answering. I've thought about it, and I think that there are 2 things that mitigate our discussions of dogma now. Not that we ignore them, not that we don't know it's there, but it mitigates our discussions of it publicly. One is inclusivity. There's a very strong movement towards, in the general air, towards all kinds of inclusivity. And parallel with that, or dovetailing that, it becomes difficult to have discussions on the specialness of the Jews towards the relationship with Hashem. And I'm highly aware of that. My kids, posit things all the time, and I think the younger generation is struggling with that.
I thought you were going one way, but I feel like you're taking in a different direction. Are you saying inclusivity amongst within the Jewish community?
Yes, yeah.
And
Yeah,
therefore everybody
within the broader Jewish community. Yeah, I'm not talking about outsiders.
okay.
I'm talking about a particularly Jewish discussion
and everybody
of
might
dogma.
have their own personal relationship or
No, even that's part of it, but even the fact that how open is our tent to other branches of Yahadut, let's call it that. And because dogma runs straight up against that in a number of things, not in everything, but I think that inhibits the discussion in this day and age.
I'm very interested in hearing your response to two excerpts that we're going to look at today, one by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs and the other one by, in a book review of Kellner's book, or a book critique rather, of Kellner's book by Professor David Berger. Both of them hit on two of the points that you just made. Mark.
I would jump in and say maybe a little differently, or going back even a little further. You know, to put it simply, dogma is not Torah Sinai. I mean, it just isn't. And, you know, it arose in a very specific era within a very specific cultural, political, historical milieu. And look, let's be clear, you know, whether we want to acknowledge it or not, you know, when someone like Baruch Spinoza, Benedict Spinoza comes along and develops a whole concept, or begins to articulate a whole concept of reason and of a religion around reason, and that becomes developed into Haskalah and other elements of that percolate through Jewish thought. I think it's almost impossible for dogma to stand on its own, and it's not. But most importantly, it's not necessary for it to stand on its own, because it's not as if it is sourced Sinai in a way that says that to deny it is somehow to deny something that, you know, really is midoraisa, for example, or even rabbinic, you know, from the Talmudic period. So I think that it's almost a natural extension of science and reason.
But Mark, would you say maybe all of Rambam's, you wouldn't necessarily say are doraita or even derived from doraita, but do you think that there is some dogma that is doraita, even if it's not necessarily explicit? These are the confines of.
Absolutely. There are clearly some bedrock principles that are necessary cornerstones of who we are, you know, religiously speaking. But to articulate them in the precision and the detail that was done through the medieval dogmatic approach to things, I think is not necessary. And in many respects, it smacks against the face of this historical development.
Do you think, though, that there's universal acceptance in what you just called the bedrock or the essential, dogma that are explicit within Torah, but not necessarily systematized in a really confined way?
Yeah, so I think there are a few elements that are. But just like if you take issues around the afterlife and Olam Haba and what that really is, and if you really kind of dive into it and recognize that there's no even dogma within the broad expanse of Jewish history as to what that constitutes, I think that when you get into areas like that, the areas of dogma around that, frankly, sit on much shakier ground than the dogmas around, God being one, and that's why I think that's where I would distinguish them.
Okay, yeah.
So I'll just jump in here. So Rabbi Mintz gave a talk at the Jewish Center some time ago, and he asked the question, why is there almost no discussion about a requirement to believe in God? And he said that for most people this was just assumed. And that there was no real need to focus on it.
Right. And that's what we were arguing at the very beginning of our studies together. In biblical time, God's presence was more palpable. They experienced miracles. They didn't need the belief that God existed if they felt it. That what they needed is a belief in him, a trust in him, a confidence in him, a reliance on him, and a commitment to observe his will, not the intellectual propositions that God exists or is one, or is incorporeal. Yaakov, what did you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously Malcolm Kellner would disagree with this, but to some extent it could be with halacha, it has to, change as the world changes. The, technology adapts. Halacha has to figure out how to incorporate new things, but dogma doesn't really. So I guess one could say, well, these, few medieval, Jewish philosophers kind of hashed out all of the relevant points, and we can go back and read their books, but there really isn't much else to hash out on Jewish philosophy, on Jewish dogma. Maybe not according to Malcolm Kellner, but maybe one could think that way.
Okay. Okay, yeah. And so your perception of the modern conception of dogma is there's more fluidity or no?
In what sense?
Meaning if they hashed out all of the specifics, are you saying there's no need to hash out more? Or are you saying in the modern era, just like there's more room to kind of apply or evolve halacha, similarly there would be with regard to theological conceptions?
Oh, no, I was saying the former, as in, again, with different technology, Shabbos and kashrut and whatnot, those kind of get updated to, to modern technology, but there's no real
dogma, whatever
really
was hashed out in the medieval era stays.
Right.
Okay. So I want to begin with Menachem Kellner's conclusion in his introduction. So he wrote a more academic work, Dogma in Medieval Jewish Philosophy, but he wrote a more popular work, meaning based on his more academic work, there was a lot of encouragement for him to write a more popular work to kind of make it more accessible for the layperson. And therefore he wrote a book called Must a Jew Believe Anything, a far more provocative title. And in this book, which is really, written in a very accessible style, he wrote in the introduction, meaning the conclusion or his thesis in the introduction is what I have here at the top of the page. Must a Jew believe anything? And this is what he says. If belief is a matter of trust in God, expressed in obedience of the Torah, my answer, and that's what we've been talking about as belief in, as opposed to belief that, my answer to the question is that a Jew must believe everything. If belief is the intellectual acquiescence in carefully defined statements of dogma, or what we've been calling belief that, the answer is that there is nothing that a Jew must believe. So he's writing in a very provocative way, and that's why it generated a lot of discussion amongst many Jewish academics, many Orthodox rabbis, and Orthodox academics. And there is what to take issue with. But first of all, how do you feel about this claim? If it's a matter of belief in, he's arguing Jews must believe in God. Jews must believe in everything. It's more of the effective trust in God that a Jew is obligated to have. But with regard to belief that, with regard to intellectual propositions about God, there is nothing, he says, a Jew must believe. How would you respond to this claim? I'll show you how some of his opponents respond to it. But how do you feel about this claim? Do you find it compelling? Do you agree with it?
I like it.
Issue with it?
I like it a lot, actually. I find that it summarizes in a very pithy way part of what I was suggesting before. The bedrock belief of a belief in God, as opposed to a belief that, and then going through 15 principles of faith, or 12 principles, or 8 principles, or 20, or whatever anyone wants to define. So I like that, because I find that very satisfying from an ability to assimilate that belief in God with the realities of the world that we live in today.
Right. But when I pushed you a little further, Mark, before, you did say there were some intellectual beliefs.
Right. So
would say are even d'oraita. Here he doesn't necessarily seem to imply that, because he's arguing more if it's a matter of trust in God expressed in obedience to the Torah. That's not necessarily intellectual. It's more effective and functional in the way that Norman Lamb would describe.
But if you want to take even that, I think, to its absolute conclusion, you can't escape that ultimately there's still an element of dogma there. There has to be.
Meaning
then
if
you're
you're
just
observing God's commands, you're thereby believing in
yeah.
his
So
commands.
there's definitionally that's the case. So the answer is yeah. I mean that part, you can parse some words, but it's a slippery slope if you think that you can completely separate the two. You can't.
Right. But with regard to, so I agree with you in terms of, yeah. So if you're expressing a trust in God and obedience to his mitzvot, you're thereby expressing a belief in his existence. But with regard to unity and corporeality, that's really not obligatory, would you say, according to Kellner?
No, I don't think that's necessarily the case, because again, you can parse through what those particular elements mean, and you can break them up into little pieces. But if you think of it sort of as more of an amorphous view as to the infiniteness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I think you end up in the same place.
Okay. Anyone take issue with Kellner's thesis here? Anybody find it challenging or not compelling? I'm interested to see what you think of David Berger's response to it in a few minutes. But first, I want to look at Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, and this excerpt actually speaks to what Vivian had said earlier about inclusivity. And Kellner quotes Rabbi Sachs here from his book, One People. And he says, inclusivism then uses classic halachic strategies, variants on the themes of minhag avotehem biyadehem, habits, not beliefs, or tinok shenishba. Garth, we talked about this a little while ago, several classes ago, meaning when we excuse people out of ignorance for holding heretical beliefs. So variants on these themes, right? These classic halachic strategies, the rabbis use to include within the covenantal community those whose beliefs and practices would, if taken at their face value, place them outside. It's an extraordinarily powerful device capable of neutralizing the seismic impact of almost any Jewish ideology at odds with tradition. Its method, considered as a formal halachic device, is to isolate the liberal or secular Jew from his beliefs. The beliefs remain heretical, but those who believe them are not heretics. They do not ultimately or culpably believe them. Liberal and secular Jews remain Jews, even though neither liberal or secular Judaism is Judaism.
Ooh.
Harsh, huh?
Them fighting words.
I was surprised when I read it at first. No, but I think with regard to attitudes towards dogma and with this effort, towards inclusivity, especially within the Jewish community, within different denominations of the Jewish community, it's very challenging to maintain a Maimonidean perspective where one defines a Jew based on one's beliefs that are held, right? We talked about Rambam saying you are included within Klal Yisrael and considered a Jew if you affirm these 13 Ikarim. And if you deny any of them, if you don't hold any of them for whatever reason, you're excluded from Klal Yisrael, from immortality, from Olam Haba, etc. And so that is divisive. That clearly is exclusive. And that's why many pushed up against Rambam, arguing that it's too elite and that God wouldn't make human perfection or make immortality or make Olam Haba only achievable by he who could achieve the intellectual perfection or the requisite affirmation of Ikarim. And so what Rabbi Sachs is doing here by excluding dogma from the definition of a Jew, he includes others within Klal Yisrael, even if they don't necessarily hold those exclusive beliefs. And so Kellner argues against Rambam and kind of the elitism or the exclusivism of Rambam. He says a true Maimonidean is forced to admit that even sweet-tempered, well-intentioned, Jewishly committed, reform and conservative Jews are heretics and have no share in the world to come. It should also be remembered that on Maimonides' account, fervently Orthodox Jews who are confused about the nature of God's incorporeality, who believe that Yehoshua wrote the last few verses of Dvarim, or who prayed to the angel Metatron, or who use photographs of great rabbis as good luck charms, are all heretics and have no share in the world to come. I wrote a Dvar Torah in the bulletin a few weeks ago, and I quoted Moshe Halpertal and Avisha Margalit in their book Idolatry, and they argue that idolatry for Rambam was just having the wrong conception about God, and so Rambam could be davening in shul right next to another observant Jew. And if that Jew had the wrong conception about God or had a corporeal conception of God, Rambam would say such a person is a heretic and such a person is an idolater, even though from the externals, they both appear to be observing the exact same way, praying, to the same God. And so Rambam is exclusive in this way if he's defining Jews as only being who hold certain beliefs, even if one is meticulous in one's halachic observance, if one holds an erroneous belief, even well-intendedly, right? Even if one believes that Yehoshua authored the last 8 verses of the Torah when it talks about Moshe's death, or even if one believes that they took the Torah literally and they understood anthropomorphisms in a corporeal way, such a person would be considered a heretic. Such a person would be deprived of a chelek in olam haba. And
but that's always a dangerous comparison to make, because you're putting Rambam, who lived, in the 1100s into the the 21st century, and that's just a dangerous gameplay. Rambam's world was a world of Qur'im and Muslims. It wasn't a world of this diverse spectrum of secular humanism that permeates a lot of modern society. So I think that's as I said, I think it's dangerous to take that philosophy, to drop it right into what we live in today and say, you see, this is what Rambam would have automatically come to the conclusion of.
And it's also, it's speculative. We talked about a lot of different theories in terms of what Rambam's motivations were these actually his beliefs that one, loses their chelek olam haba, they don't believe in them. What was the obligatory nature of the belief more than affirmation? But does one have to philosophically be able to demonstrate, proofs of any of these ikarim? Was this more of a pedagogical guide for the masses? Was this really in response to those who were being religiously coerced in his day? And he was trying to actually be more inclusive in the sense that he was telling them, what really matters is your dogma. So don't feel like all is lost if you had to abandon your physical observance in order to, conform to the norms of the Muslims, amongst whom you were living. As long as you maintain your dogma, you can still retain, your Judaism. So there are a lot of different speculative theories in terms of what was Maimonides' motivations for delineating them, specifically within the Perush Mishnayot for the masses, and what did he actually believe in terms of these 13? Was just these exclusive 13? Was this really not an exhaustive list, but really represented much more than that? There are, and still, continue among Maimonidean scholars to be a range of different opinions. So yes, you're right that it's always challenging to impose Rambam's, 12th century opinions on, modern times. At the same time, we still do study his Mishnah Torah, we still do study his Perush Mishnayot, and we have to try to understand to the extent that we can the text in which, and the way he wrote it. But I want to look at 2 other excerpts from Kellner before we get to his critics. And here he says, reducing Judaism to a complex of behavioral norms rubs against the grain of the tradition as much as does reducing Judaism to a series of dogmatic statements. Both are exaggerations and both misrepresent the nature of classical Judaism. The Torah has important things to say to us on an intellectual plane. These include, for example, and this is what Mark was saying before, the affirmations of God's existence and unity, the rejection of idolatry in all its forms, and ideas concerning the purpose of human and natural existence. That the Torah teaches truth, which it does not mean that these truths are expressed in an explicit, detailed, systematic fashion. nor does it mean that correct and self-conscious affirmations of these truths in all their specificity is a sine qua non of being Jewish. So I think the point that I was trying to kind of elicit when I was asking Mark to go a little bit further is it's not all or nothing, right? It's not that it's just about halacha, the chavot tevarim, as Abachi Ibn Pekudei would put it, but it's also not just about the dogma. And I think what Mark articulated earlier was that, yes, it could be really the focus of emunah can be on trust in God, on commitments to the halakha, expressing one's belief in God through one's actions that are here obedience to his will, yet still it kind of the prerequisites that one can derive from that are that one believes in God and the necessary beliefs around God's existence, perhaps unity and corporeality, etc. And Kellner says it's further important to realize that even though classical Judaism does not understand the nature of emunah as Maimonides does, and therefore places little value and emphasis on precise theological formulations, there are limits to what one can affirm or deny and still remain within the Jewish community. Note my terminology here. There are limits to what one can affirm or deny and still remain within the Jewish community. Denying the unity of God, for example, or that the Torah of divine origin in some significant sense, or affirming that the Mashiach has already come, are claims which place one outside of the historical community of Israel. How to respond to such a people is a question which, I think, is best decided on an ad hoc basis. Indeed, it's a question which cannot be answered in one fashion for all of us. This is how Kellner ends his book. How do you feel about this argument? First, he's saying, right, so even if we don't want to accept Rambam's understanding of emunah as affirmations or beliefs in, theological commitments about God, he does acknowledge that there are limits to what one can affirm or deny and still remain within the Jewish community. Right? There are limits to what one can affirm and deny and still remain within the Jewish community. Because denying the unity of God or that the Torah is of divine origin, or affirming that the Mashiach has already come, like the Christians were arguing in the disputations, those are claims which places one outside the historical community of Israel. But look at his last argument. How to respond to such a person is a question which I think is best decided on an ad hoc basis. It's a question which cannot be answered in one fashion for everyone. How do you feel about that as the conclusion to his book?
Seems like he thinks there's some level of dogma after all.
Okay. So
I
is
also
that
think
clearly defined?
I think it's a very diplomatic statement, and in the nature of neighborliness to one's fellow Jew, he's encouraging some sort of a latitude which denies dogma in a sense. He's sort of indicating that you should seek to build bridges as opposed to, to reject people.
Okay. But he's still saying, but there is a sense of
There are
dogma.
lines. There are definitely lines.
There
Yeah.
are lines which places one outside of the community.
Yes.
But are those lines clear?
Well, some of them are and some of them aren't. He gave the easy examples.
Okay.
But you could debate his examples.
Okay.
I mean, because at a deeper 30,000 feet level, he seems to be trying to define what is the essence of Judaism. And so there's a bit of dogma and there's a bit of halakha, but to take the example, the belief that the Mashiach has come, was some great rabbis of the biblical period believed that the Mashiach was there amongst them, but that was incorrect. But they weren't outside the community of Israel.
Okay. How do you feel about that last part where he says basically you just need to respond to people on an ad hoc basis, right? It's not a one size fits all answer, but you kind of have to address each individual according to the particular circumstances. Any thoughts on that? Let's look at David Berger's thoughts on that. It doesn't sit well with him. Okay, so first I just want to remind you, because this is specifically and linguistically, this is what Berger refers to. Okay, so I just want to remind you what we started tonight's lesson with. In the thesis of Must Did You Believe Anything, Kellner, and just look at the wording here, because this is what Berger slices. Kellner writes, we looked at this already, just reminding you, he says, must did you believe anything? If belief is a matter of trust in God expressed in obedience to the Torah, what we call belief in, my answer to the question is that a Jew must believe everything. Mark like this point. If belief is the intellectual acquiescence in carefully defined statements of dogma, what we call belief that, the answer is that there is nothing that a Jew must believe. Okay, so now we're going to look at Professor David Berger's book review of Kellner, where he takes issue with Kellner's wording. Okay, so look at how he argues. Berger writes, the alert reader will immediately notice that the key final sentence contains a qualifying expression with an ironic effect. The term carefully defined, right? What he's saying here, the intellectual acceptance in carefully defined statements of dogma, there's nothing that a Jew must believe. So Berger's saying the term carefully defined blurs careful definition, so that we do not know if the author means to deny that a Jew need assent to any dogmatic proposition at all. If he does not mean to deny this, the word anything here, must did you believe anything, is, to put it mildly, rather misleading. Look at how he goes on. We have an obligation to maintain the boundaries of the faith bequeathed us by our ancestors. And we cannot do this by describing even fundamental deviations as points on a continuum. Since every orthodoxy, indeed every coherent movement, must have boundaries, setting them in a reasonable place encourages respect for differences within those boundaries. Refusing to set them at all may well lead to the blurring of the central and the peripheral, the ikar and the tafel, and lead to the position that virtually all deviations illegitimate. It hardly needs to be said that this danger is very much with us. So he's arguing against kind of that inclusivity argument that we were making earlier. He's saying that any movement needs to have boundaries, and those boundaries encourage respect for the differences. But if you just have this continuum and everyone's just in a different place along the spectrum and everything is acceptable, one loses the ikar. One loses what defines one as a member within that movement.
Yeah, but I find it odd that he phrases it in the opposite of the way I would have thought, where
What?
he says, and lead to the position that virtually all deviations delegitimate. I would have thought he would have said it. This is saying it in the.
No, refusing to set them all, right, lead to the blurring of what's really significant.
But refusing to say it again, refusing to
set any boundaries lead to the blurring of what actually is obligatory and what's not. Right, all deviations.
I like the blurring. You know, there was a great passage in Walter Isaacson's book about Leonardo da Vinci, where he describes the painting method called sfumato, which is something that da Vinci really mastered in terms of, in order to create the most realistic view of someone, you actually end up blurring the lines and the edges of everything in order to create the best realism, ironically. So in some respects, that whole notion of blurring really sits very well with me. It's precisely in that element of blurring, it's precisely in the notion of continuum that you get actually the most realistic representation. If something is purely black and white and has to have an absolute defined line, then in the end, it actually, in some levels, doesn't come across as realistic. So I like that comparison, and I think that sfumato, if you will, actually works well for Kellner.
Any responses to that?
Yeah, I was kind of wondering, but isn't it in fact, is Kellner's intention to go for that sfumato as you described it? That's a good use of the term. Is he endorsing that, or is he not endorsing that? I'm not so clear.
Why would you think he's not endorsing that blurring?
Because he does seem to state that if you fuzz the lines, then you lose the ikar, and then none of the system works, or none of the belief
No,
system
that's
works.
what Berger is arguing, but that's not what Kellner is arguing. Berger is responding to Kellner. Berger is criticizing Kellner.
Right, but I'm saying that is Berger's critique of Kellner.
Right. Right. That's Berger's critique of Kellner. Kellner, I think, is arguing that those lines can be blurred because there's really no explicit, dogma that one needs to affirm, right? If we're talking about belief that, then there's nothing a Jew must believe. It's more about the effective trust in God and expression functionally through one's observance of his mitzvot.
But Kellner says something different to that towards the end of the last quote when he said that these are defining beliefs. So he is setting boundaries.
Then he said, meaning in the previous excerpt when he said that historically those have excluded one from a Jewish community. Yes, but he's not
endorsing it. He's saying historically it was the case.
And he's also saying there are limits to what one can affirm and still remain within the Jewish community. He's not taking it to the extremes of Rambam in terms of you lose your chilek in olam haba, you're not considered a Jew, you're not within the traditional kahal, but he does say how to respond to such a person should be decided on an ad hoc basis. It's not like these people are excluded to the extent that there's no, way of embracing them. There's no way of allowing them to come back if they change their views. It's not this same finality, and it's not the same kind of, you remember what Rambam said at the end of the Perush Mishnayot, you are obligated to hate them, to loathe them, and he quotes a couple of psukim. It's not nearly, he's saying how we deal with them has to be, determined on an ad hoc basis, and each circumstance is considered individually.
But aren't they both saying there are boundaries? So,
Yes,
Kellner might use the word limits.
But Berger's are much more clearly defined, and Kellner's are much more blurred. But Kellner does acknowledge there are some limits. So this eruption of critique, and Berger, critiqued him strongly. Some of the other Jewish philosophers were a little bit more generous with their reviews. Regardless, these critiques encouraged or motivated Kellner to write an afterword in the second edition that was published 5 years later. And in this afterword, he responds to Berger and other critics. And you'll tell me what you think in terms of, does he backtrack or does he kind of double down on his thesis from the first edition? This is what he writes in the afterword. He says, but, and this my critics fail to grasp, to say that Judaism does not demand that we express beliefs about God and God's relationship to the world in the form of dogmas is not to say that all Judaism demands of its adherents is a kind of mindless practice. The critics ignore two issues. A, one can love someone and act on that love while knowing very little about the object of that love. And B, Judaism prizes kavana, or intention, over rote behavior. Maimonides certainly did not demand mindless uniformity to belief, but he definitely preached thoughtful uniformity and seemed to have no qualms about deploying thought police. Godhelm Ephraim Lessing is famous for having maintained that if God were to offer him all truth in the right hand and the eternal search for truth in the left, he would choose the left. Maimonides, in common with all the other medievals, would choose the right hand and expected others to do so as well. Those who failed to choose the truth were to be condemned. Rabbi Isaac Abravanel is reputed to have ended lectures on Maimonides' philosophy with the words, "This is the opinion of Rabbeinu Moshe," meaning Rambam, not of Moshe Rabbeinu. Abravanel thought that Maimonides held views at variance with those taught in the Torah, but he still taught those views in public. Would that Jews today could put up with each other with as much forbearance. What do you think about Kellner's response to his critics? And what do you think he adds in this afterwards to his original thesis? Does he backtrack? Does he double down? Does he qualify? Does he address some of the criticisms that he perhaps felt were well-founded by his critics? Does he defend himself?
He's one of the things he's doing is he does seem to say, I too hold that there are some principles that crossing that line is a transgression. He does admit that those exist.
Right.
At the same time, he seems to say that to be a seeker on the path is of greater value than mindless
Affirmation of those.
right, affirmation, mindless affirmation. So he's holding both truths, actually.
But he doesn't formalize what those intellectual principles are.
He's ducking that one.
He's ducking that one, and also seems to say, how do you feel about the two points that I put in bold here? One can love someone and act on that love while knowing very little about the object of the love. Meaning his point there is saying you could have belief in without belief that. Meaning you don't have to understand the nature of God's existence, the nature of God's unity, the nature of God's incorporeality to still trust in that being and to still serve that being through observance of his commandments. Meaning one could still be devoutly submissive to God, even if one doesn't necessarily have the proper conceptions, theological conceptions or intellectual conceptions about God. And the second point he's making there, Judaism prizes kavana over rote behavior. That also seems to go against a lot of what we were talking about, especially with regard to accidental heresy, with regard to Rambam, right? Rambam, yes, you have to have the proper understanding about God, but even if you are well-intended, if you don't come to that proper understanding, too bad. You don't have the intellectual prerequisites to achieve human perfection. Right here, he's saying Judaism provides kavana over rote behavior, right? If I have the proper intentions, even if I don't necessarily come to the proper beliefs, I still wouldn't be penalized. I still, those kavanot would be taken into consideration. How do you feel about those two in your own kind of theological understanding? How do you feel about those 2 points? Compelling or not? And do you think that Kellner is kind of doubling down or taking his point further, or kind of backtracking and acquiescing a bit to some of the criticisms on his original thesis? Ideas, thoughts? How does this?
It seems like
he's explaining it. I mean, I don't think he changed position. I think he was clarifying it to make it clearer. I don't think there's a change.
Okay. Do you find his points compelling? Do you find his thesis compelling? Do you feel like when you're thinking about modern conceptions of dogma, and even what you were saying earlier in terms of the motivations to be inclusive within the larger, broader Jewish community, do you feel his stance is cogent, or do you feel like it's not necessarily reflective of your conception of orthodoxy? You don't have to answer personally. You can answer more communally if you feel more comfortable.
I'll answer personally. I'm struggling with it.
Yeah. Anyone else? I think what I sought to do over the course of the semester was to encourage more thoughtful reflection about dogma. I think even, since Bach put this time, and this is exactly what he was arguing, and I think it's still, true to some extent today, the focus so much is on halachic observance. Sometimes we get very bogged down, especially as we kind of prepare for Pesach in the coming weeks, we get very bogged down with kind of meticulous observance of halakha. And sometimes we lose sight of the proper conceptions of what we're doing this for, who we're doing it for. And I think kind of reflecting back upon biblical and rabbinic periods and the way they conceived of God, I think thinking through the different delineations of dogma in the medieval period, and then kind of applying that to an extent, or to whatever extent is possible or appropriate in terms of our modern conceptions of God, how we conceptualize God when we pray, when we learn, when we talk, in theological terms. I think it's important to reflect more, especially in the modern era, where this is not necessarily the subject of, tremendous discussion anymore, as it hasn't been, for many, many, many generations. So I think the efforts, of this series was really to encourage you all, or people in general, to think through what does it mean to believe in God? How do we properly conceptualize God? How do we understand God's relationship with us in this world with regard to providence, with regard to reward and punishment? How do we have the proper conception so that our prayer is more appropriate and impactful, so that our commitment to mitzvot is more sincere and meaningful? And I think by concentrating a little bit more, or thinking or reflecting upon the proper theological commitments, we can enhance our overall, commitments, both in terms of our thoughts and also in terms of our practice. So I hope that through understanding the different opinions of dogma throughout the ages and the evolution of dogma from the biblical, rabbinic, medieval, and contemporary times, I hope you're able to think in a little bit more sophisticated terms and a little bit, in deeper ways about your theological commitments and about your relationship with God and about your observance in general. And hopefully that will enhance your meaning and your commitments and your overall, approach and worldview as it relates to Judaism. So these aren't answers. These aren't one size fits all. These aren't conclusive responses to these questions, but often in philosophy, the questions, will just elicit further and further reflection. And that really, is the ultimate goal, as we saw in that lesson quote that we ended with. So I hope that you gain from our discussions throughout the generations of dogma, and I hope it will continue to encourage you to think through these ideas and to allow your relationship with God and your understanding of your theological commitments to continue to grow and evolve in your religious experience. So
I have
thank
a
you.
question. Shira.
So do I.
Yeah, go ahead.
If somebody, Shira, if somebody who didn't know anything about Judaism asked you, what does it mean to be Jewish? To what extent would you include dogma in your answer?
I'll show you one. I wasn't planning on doing it, but I'll show you one idea, and you can tell me what sits better with you. We didn't look at conversion, but if somebody asks you what it means to be Jewish, we didn't look at this text, but you might be familiar with it already. In Gemara Yevamot, it says, our rabbis taught, if at the present time a man desires to become a proselyte, he is to be addressed as follows. What reason do you have for desiring to become a proselyte? Do you not know that Israel at the present time are persecuted and oppressed, despised, harassed, and overcome by afflictions? If he replies, I know, and yet I'm unworthy, he's accepted forthwith and given instruction in some of the minor and major commandments. He is told of the punishment for the transgression of the commandments, as he is informed of the punishment for the transgression of the commandments. So he is informed of the reward granted for their fulfillment. Okay, so according to the Gemara, if you want to convert, you try to discourage him. Don't you understand that Jews are the despised people? But if he still wants to convert, you tell him about the major and the minor commandments and the rewards and the punishments that are associated with it. Okay. Rambam in the Mishnah Torah in Hilchot Arayot, he adds something. Look what he says. Our rabbis taught, based on what we just read in the Gemara Yevamot, it at the present time a man desires to become a proselyte, he is to be addressed as follows. What reason do you have for desiring to become a proselyte? Do you not know that Israel at present are persecuted and oppressed, etc., etc.? If he replies, I know and yet I'm worthy, he is accepted for with. This is what Rambam adds in parentheses. He should then be made acquainted with the principles of the faith, which are the oneness of God and the prohibition of idolatry. These matters should be discussed in great detail and given instruction, though not at length, in some of the minor and major commandments. He is also told of the punishment for the transgression of the commandments, as he is informed of the punishment for the transgression of the commandments, so he is informed of the reward granted for their fulfillment. The point is, Garth, and what I was, thinking of when you asked, what does it mean to be a Jew, right? And that's what you're asking, right? If somebody wants to convert to Judaism, what does it entail? And so the Gemara just seems to say, you have to try to dissuade him just so you can kind of see his proper intentions. And if not, you have to just tell him the basics, the basic halachot and the rewards or punishment associated with them. Rambam says no, and this is consistent with what Rambam believes is the definition of a Jew. Rambam says you have to also tell him, and in greater detail than the halachot, you need to tell him what it means theologically to believe in God and to understand the principles. So I think it really, when you say, if somebody asks you, what does it mean to be a Jew? I think that precisely, is dependent upon if you're taking the more Maimonidean approach or if you're taking more of the traditional, rabbinic approach. Is the focus more on halachot, and obviously in both instances you try to understand their intentions, but is the focus, and this is what we asked at the very beginning with Bachim Pekude, are we obligated just in terms of our masim, or are we also obligated in terms of our machshavot, right? So some would say you just have to teach them the basics of Judaism, the basics of halacha. Others would say, no, you have to also show their theological commitments, because as Bachya would say, we don't only relate to God in terms of our actions, we also relate to God in terms of our thoughts and our inner convictions and our kavanot, et cetera, et cetera.
But it's interesting that even in the Maimonidean case there's a hierarchy of dogma.
Mm-hmm. Of those specific dogma. I mean, there's
Yeah.
certainly, even though he says for all 13, that, if you deny any of them, you lose your chelik and olam haba, there's definitely a clear focus on the first 5.
Right, exactly. He didn't say if you don't believe in Techiyat HaMeitim, we're not interested in your conversion.
Right. But they have that has a much higher status in terms of the obligatory nature than the later ones.
Shira, I find that in this day and age, one of the issues, I'm trying to think how to phrase this, that is contentious is not even so much the belief of God, but the belief in Tzionut, the belief in the Jewish connection to the land. And I find that has become a greater contentious point among Jews. Forget about outsiders. I find that's a greater issue than the belief in God. I mean, belief in God, when it gets contentious, seems to get down to how do we practice that belief, but it doesn't seem to be around the concept of belief in God. I'm finding in contemporary times, the greater question is actually the belief in Tzionut. What is the connection of God's people to the land? Right. And none of that has been addressed in any of these discussions.
Right. No, I mean, I think that's definitely true.